So art is often used by leaders seeking to manipulate the people that they govern. So Mao Zedong, he led the Communist Party to power in the Chinese Civil War that ended in 1949. So Mao ruled the most populous country in the world for 27 years. And he truly understood the power of imagery, and like many leaders before him, he used artwork to promote his political and social agenda to his thousands of subjects. Um, he came to power again after the Chinese Civil War was over. And so between 1966 and 1976, he oversaw a socio-political movement in China that we now know as Mao's Cultural Revolution. So really, he wanted to preserve communist ideology by purging the remnants of capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society as a whole. So this was a takedown of intellectuals, artists, and the upper class. Some 1.5 million people were killed during this cultural revolution, and millions of others suffered imprisonment, seizure of property, torture, and humiliation. Much of China's youth were organized into the Red Guard under Mao's leadership. And this was initially an attack on the upper classes, but really it became an attack on culture. Mao called for the destruction of the four olds, customs, culture, habits, and ideas. The city streets and places and people were renamed. Historic sites were ransacked and destroyed, especially in the city of Beijing, including the temple and burial place of Confucius. Libraries full of historical and foreign texts were burned. Temples, churches, mosques, and monasteries were closed down. And basically, if art was not in the support of Mao Zedong directly or his People's Republic of China, it was forbidden. So after declaring his country the People's Republic of China, he installed a huge portrait of himself at Tiananmen Square, or the Gate of the Heavenly Palace. Now, this was built in the 15th century as the entry gateway to the Forbidden City, which is the home of Chinese emperors, and had been traditionally for centuries. Now, Tiananmen has been the site of many important political and cultural events in Chinese history. Several bloody protests in China's communist rule took place here, most famously in 1989, when more than 100,000 people gathered in a peaceful protest of the government's corruption and unfair wages, and police responded with violence, ultimately killing several thousand. Now, the portrait of Mao Zedong here, this is a very powerful national symbol of China, even though his reign and his legacy are quite controversial. So this projected image of a benevolent leader of the Chinese Republic kind of allowed him to maintain control or maintain a hold on the Chinese people. I mean, his face appeared everywhere on money, stamps, posters, public statues and portraits like this one. He was conveying the idea that he was always watching over his citizens. And so it's sort of like a religious icon in that way. The portrait was considered to contain the essence of Mao Zedong. And so this portrait at Tiananmen Square, this is pretty typical of how Mao was portrayed. He's full-faced, he's shown as a mature man, a supremely kind of confident leader. He has somewhat of a soft, benign smile, as if he's promising prosperity for all. But the Chinese people who viewed this portrait every day would have known that that wasn't really the case. Now, it should be noted that the Mao portrait that hangs in Tiananmen today is not the same painting that was erected originally in 1949. It has been replaced with a nearly identical portrait almost every year, or at least when the current portrait was damaged by various acts of protest. And so again, even though this is not the original man or even the original portrait, it sort of conveys his essence and his power over the people. So between 1972 and 1973, the American pop artist Andy Warhol created a series of screen prints using this very recognizable portrait of Mao Zedong. Now, this took place shortly after the US President Richard Nixon returned from a historic trip to China, which opened up relations between the two countries. And so Warhol's large-scale screen-printed portraits, they sort of emphasize or highlight the perpetual replication of Mao's image within China and how it was present basically everywhere you looked. He has altered the image slightly, however. He is sort of adding splatters of paint and very bright colors, and he includes paint that mimics eyeshadow and lipstick. On the one hand, this is perhaps venerating this image even further, kind of ensuring that it stays within the public's eye. But at the same time, it's really highlighting this idea of reproduction and mass consumerism, and that sort of undermines the ideal portrayal of self that Mao Zedong was going for. So maybe it reduces his power a bit as well, by emphasizing its status as a reproduction. So it takes a very propagandist work of art and turns it on its head in a lot of ways here. All right, so let's move away from portraiture for a bit. So many ancient rulers sought to take their riches and their power with them into the afterlife. And many ancient rulers used tombs or funerary complexes as ways to not only protect their riches and their bodies in the afterlife, but also to convey their wealth and their power and status to their people. So let's look at the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. He was the first absolute imperial sovereign, or the first emperor of China. He standardized units of measurement, currency, the Chinese script, among other things. And he also began the construction of the Great Wall of China along the northern border to protect the empire from the Mongolians. He sounds like a pretty good guy, right? Well, he wasn't. He was a tyrant. He was not very well liked at all. And during his reign, there were at least 3 assassination attempts. Now, ancient emperors of China sought to take their riches with them into the afterlife, but apparently Huangdi sought to become immortal. He asked his court physician or alchemist to make him immortal, and the alchemist created some mercury pills that he believed would do this. However, it's said that the emperor actually died because he ingested these mercury pills, so that didn't work out for him. Now, according to a 1st century BCE historian named Sima Qin, who died in about 868 BCE, he wrote about the Emperor Qin preparing for death in the afterlife by building a vast underground city palace to match the one that he occupied in life. So, according to his writings, it was said that 700,000 workers were needed to build the tomb, and that Emperor Qin oversaw the building and filling of the complex for 36 years. Now, the tomb was underground and it was marked with a mound that was over 600 feet tall. The tomb itself contained a network of underground rooms and mountains with also streams of mercury that were propelled by water wheels and ceilings that were painted to represent the heavens. Now, all of this was really thought to be just a legend until 1974, when a farmer in China was digging a well on his land and he started to uncover terracotta body parts. So, um, eventually, archaeologists uncovered um, a complex filled with the emperor's treasures, all the things that he would need in the afterlife, including an army of 8,000 life-size polychrome terracotta soldiers who would guard him in the afterlife. So the soldiers have similar rigid upright stances. It's based on research, we've determined that molds were probably used to create the various body parts, and then the figures were pieced together into a general shape. However, each soldier is also unique. They have individualized features that have been added with a layer of moist clay. They have unique clothing, weaponry, and facial features. And all of this sort of seems to reflect the diverse ethnicities within the imperial forces at the time because they had been drawn from throughout the very large empire. Maybe these were conceived as actual portraits so that the spirits of the individuals could accompany their emperor into the afterlife, but we don't know for certain. Here's sort of a detail so you can really see the individualized features of the faces, the clothing, the weapons. Um, the tomb also included 1,400 chariots, some of which were inlaid with gold and silver, bronze horses, archers, infantrymen, a cavalry, and a small group of elite special forces. Now, unfortunately, 40 years after this tomb was first discovered, less than 1% of it has been excavated. There are fears that excavation might damage the contents of the tomb. There might be cave-ins that would harm the archaeologists and the people who are excavating. And there are also the rumored mercury streams that are inlaid within the floor of the burial chamber. Scientists have done samples that tested positive for mercury, and so they are very cautious about entering into the tomb and excavating further. However, it does show the economic resources and the importance of the military force that Qin had and sort of what he was able to achieve with such power. He was able to unify a war-torn China and to establish a very long-lasting cultural and political tradition within the empire. So now let's look at a couple of African kingdoms and their royal art traditions. So first I want to look at the Benin Kingdom, which was established in the 13th or 14th century around Benin City in Nigeria in West Africa. So this is a highly centralized kingdom of Edo-speaking peoples. They are ruled by an Oba, or a divine king, who is seen as the ideological center of the entire culture. And so today's Obas trace their lineage back to the original dynasty who established this kingdom. And the title of Oba is passed to the firstborn son. Now, the king is featured in most Benin art forms, or they are made specifically for him. So here we have a photograph of Oba Akinzuwa II. He ruled from 1933 to 1978. He's shown here wearing red coral beads. He has a red coral beaded hat, shirt, neck bands, waistbands, armbands. So red coral beads, these are reserved for royalty. They're very expensive symbols of kingship, and they relate to Olokun, who is the Edo god of the water or the sea, and also the creator god. So not only do these red coral beads symbolize his royal power, but his divine connection to Olokun as well. He also has ivory pendants, carved ivory wristbands, and he wears elaborate textiles. So all of this regalia is symbolic of his power. Even the red color is symbolic of the king's very potent spiritual and political power. And the color red itself is symbolic of blood and of life and of the sort of danger of the king's power. Um, Notice that in the photo he has two attendants, one on either side. They are holding up his arms, quite literally helping him bear the weight of kingship, because all of these beads and layers of regalia, that does become quite heavy. So again, the Benin Kingdom was established in the 13th or 14th centuries. It flourished. It was a very open kingdom. They traded with their neighbors, and by the 15th century, they were in contact with the Portuguese and trading with them as well. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the kingdom was really at its height, the king, again, was the focus of most art forms. Some of the most prominent works of art from this era are what we refer to as the bronze plaques of the Benin Kingdom. So here are two bronze plaques, but these are just two of nearly 1,000 rectangular brass plaques that were made via the lost wax casting process by a guild of brass casters. And these were made for display in the royal palace. According to European visitors, Palace during this period was a sprawling complex that consisted of many smaller buildings and galleries and large courtyards, and that the wooden pillars all throughout the palace were covered with these plaques from top to bottom. And so you can see on these works, they have holes drilled sort of near the top or around the edges, which would have been used to hang them or to attach them to the walls. Now, most of these plaques date to the 16th and 17th centuries. This was when contact with Portuguese travelers and traders was at its peak, and they brought lots of metal to the region. Most of the plaques depict royalty, the Oba, chiefs, court members, warriors, musicians, and some of them even depict Portuguese men. The figures are usually in high relief and with rather static poses, and they are positioned against a relatively neutral background that is just lightly patterned or textured. So here we're looking at an equestrian oba and attendants on the left. This is a nice example of hierarchical scale being used to sort of indicate the importance of the oba. He's larger in size than the other figures. He's also elevated on horseback. His arms are being supported by his attendants, and he's being shielded by a couple of other attendants. He was wearing beaded collars and lots of regalia. And he's in this very stiff frontal pose. Maybe this is some sort of ceremonial posture. But we do have a good amount of detail in the regalia, the objects being held, things like that. Now, the one on the right here, this is actually a warrior, maybe some sort of chief or general and his attendants. It's a bit more intact than the previous one. You can really see where the nails would have been placed quite clearly. But we have a high-ranking warrior in the center with those of lesser rank on the sides. He has beads and hip pendants, which all emphasize his rank. He wears a leopard tooth necklace, and he has leopard spot scarification marks. The leopard is a very powerful, fearsome creature, and so by adopting the marks and the tooth, he's sort of symbolizing his own ferocity or his own power. He holds a spear in one hand and then a ceremonial sword in the other. Here's another one, and this one is quite interesting. So this one depicts an oba with mudfish legs. So we have a single figure, an oba. He's shown again wearing the beaded collar and hat and shirt and all of this regalia. And he's shown grasping the tails of these two small leopards and holding them up in the air. So again, the leopard is a very ferocious, fearsome beast in the jungle. And so one of the king's praise names is Leopard of the House, which sort of indicates his power, his status and strength. But notice, instead of legs, we have two mudfish. Mudfish are a species of fish. They are aquatic, of course. However, they are also able to burrow into the mud to hibernate during the dry season. And then when the rains return, they seemingly come back to life and rise up from the mud and walk across the land to get back to the water. So Edo peoples and other African cultures associate them with both the world of the living and the world of the dead. So they're sort of seen as being liminal creatures. And mudfish identify the king with the deity of the sea or of the water, Olokun. Now, overseas trade was very important to the Oba's power. And of course, that would have been associated with the sea or water and therefore Olokun. Um, and so maybe since mudfish can be in and out of water, they're meant to demonstrate the king's power on land and at sea. Or maybe the king's power in life and his sort of spiritual or divine power. But there are also accounts of an early 15th century Oba named Ohen that suggest he was paralyzed. So maybe this is also referring to him. Or maybe it's just, again, depicting the earthly and supernatural powers of these Obas. So now I just want to scoot ever so slightly over and talk about the neighboring Yoruba kingdom. So the Yoruba are a ethno-linguistic group who occupy Nigeria. They are the largest ethnic group in Nigeria, and the peoples probably settled within this region maybe as early as the 8th or 9th century. But Yoruba kings are also considered to be sacred. They're very similar to Edo kings in a lot of ways. But in the past, they were considered to be so sacred that they didn't have a lot of freedoms. They couldn't be seen in public. They had to wear special regalia to conceal their identities, which sort of emphasizes the mysterious and sacred aspect. However, it's also very alienating. It sort of separates the king from his people, right? However, Yoruba kings, who are also called Obas, they are considered to have an abundance of a spiritual power called Ashe. Ashe is like a person's life force, but it is also kind of a supernatural power. Kings have a lot of it, and so do Yoruba women. But the king is believed to have so much of this power that if you were to look at him in the face or in the eyes, you could get zapped or kind of hurt or harmed. So the king traditionally wears an elaborately beaded and veiled crown to conceal his identity and to protect the people from his power. So the crown itself is sort of a wickerwork cone that is covered with a stiff fabric canvas that is then embroidered with glass beads in brightly colored designs. Now, ritually potent materials and medicines are placed inside the crown to enhance the king's powers. But then the beaded fringe veil is really the prime symbol of kingship. And only Obas who can trace their lineage directly to Oduduwa, the mythical first king of the Yoruba people, can wear a veiled crown like this. Here are a couple other images so that you can see some of the details of these crowns. Generally, they are decorated in 3 tiers, and each tier has sort of an abstracted face, which is meant to depict the royal ancestors that the king is descended from. And Oduduwa, the original founding king himself. These refer to a mystical union between the living Oba and his deified predecessors. He relies on their wisdom and their powers, and they have sort of this all-seeing nature that they share with him. Now, between the faces, we often see 3-dimensional beaded birds, and then often there will be a larger beaded bird with real tail feathers, perched on the top of the cone. The top bird is sometimes said to be an egret, which is the bird of decorum for the Yoruba people. It's a symbol of orderliness and a settler of disputes. Others say that it is a paradise flycatcher, which is also a royal signifier, and it has extra long tail feathers like the one seen in the image on the left here. Some say that the bird is a pigeon, which is apparently a symbol of victory and political power. But in the Yoruba culture, birds in general are seen as symbols of Ashe, of that supernatural power or life force, the power of kings and of women. And it's also believed that especially powerful women, elder women and witches, they can transform into birds at night. And so these birds on the crowns are symbolizing that power as well. Now, when the king wears the sacred fringed crown, it covers his head, which is thought to be the location of his ashe, of his power. So it protects his power and enhances it by increasing the connection to the deified ancestors. Um, So the Oba's palace, which is called an Afen, it is the site of the most sacred worship and celebrations. And so in the 19th and 20th century, artists were commissioned to create objects that would enhance the splendor of these palaces, and objects that would record the exploits of the king and his chiefs, that would maybe display religious symbols or metaphors for the public. And the kings historically sought out the most skillful artists from their own kingdoms and even beyond. So one well-known Yoruba sculptor from the 20th century was Olowe of Ise. Um, there is praise poetry written about him that refers to him as the leader of all carvers. But he made objects for a variety of palaces and kingdoms here. So these images show some veranda posts at the Ikere Palace in Nigeria. These were created between about 1910 and 1940. And so the posts themselves, um, the two, well, I'm looking at the image on the left here. The two posts on either end are functionally supporting the roof. The post in the middle is not actually. It is more of a freestanding sculpture. It does not support the roof. However, that's the one we're going to focus on here for the most part. Um, so the central post has the king seated with the queen behind him. The far post depicts probably a warrior chief riding in, holding a spear and a gun, riding in on his horse. And then this post closest to us in the photo, this is probably another queen or the queen again with a couple of the children. There are actually two children. You can only see one in the photo, but there's one on either side of her. But here's a better image, so you can actually see what that central posts look like. So we have the king enthroned. You can see him seated there in front of the queen. Notice his crown, kind of this conical form with a bird perched right on the top. And you can sort of see the texture of the crown that Olowe of Ise has included in the carving to mimic the small glass beads that would appear on the king's actual crown. Now, in front of the king, a small woman kneels, um, praising him or thanking him, presumably. And then on one side, the servant stands with a fan, and then a herald is standing with a whistle on the other side. But the most prominent figure, aside from the king here, is the very tall, stately queen that stands behind the throne. Now, it's interesting, she's huge in comparison to the small king. His feet dangle from his throne, and she's maybe twice, almost three times his size. This is sort of implying that the king's power is not in his physical stature, but in the mystical power which is derived from the royal ancestors and resides within his crown. Um, Now, again, this also refers to the power of women with the bird on top of the crown and the queen's large scale. So it's sort of conceding that the king and really all of creation rely on the forces that women ultimately control. So she is supporting the king. His power might be overt, but her power is hidden. Is probably greater than his, but it's hidden away, and she uses it to support him. Now, she's also painted blue. That may seem sort of strange, but blue in this case is a symbolic color, I believe relating to power and Ashe as well.